Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the fourth annual Laboratory of Feminist Memory event, Intimate Dwellings Edition. So I'm going to just introduce SMACT. The Studio for Media Activism and Critical Thought launched in 2014 at Ryerson University as a laboratory for some of Canada's most compelling media scholars, artists, and activists. Mobilizing knowledge across the city, we organize an exciting yearly roster of symposia, yearly speaker series, workshops, and student/faculty research creation outputs. The studio brings together Ryerson students, staff, and faculty, as well as faculty, artists, and activists from across the GTA and beyond. Ultimately, SMACT is blurring the lines between media, art making, activism, and scholarly investigation. We encourage you to fill in our contact form on our website for updates and are extending a special invitation to Ryerson students and faculty to join our working group. We're so excited to have you here and I'm going to hand it over to Dhvani for the land acknowledgement.
Thanks so much, Imani. So before we get started, I just wanted to do a land acknowledgement. So I wanted to take a moment to first acknowledge this land and the privilege we have to be able to gather here today. And so we acknowledge that the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And we also recognize this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. And I also wanted to invite us all to think about where you are personally situated upon and the relationship and position you have to the land. And as a settler immigrant, I'm acknowledging also that land acknowledgements can often, particularly within a university context, come across as institutional and performative, and also act as a settler move to innocence, a term described in Eve Tuck's article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. So land acknowledgement therefore shouldn't be the end to an action, but rather act as a call to action, since the dispossession and displacement of Indigenous lands and peoples is an ongoing fact happening today. So I think if many of us who are also settlers in this room should continue to consider how we're complicit in the project of settler colonialism and the tangible steps that we can take beyond formal recognition. And to that end, I encourage people in the room to consider donating to the Land Back Lane Legal Fund. And I'll be putting the GoFundMe link in the chat box, and to consider following mutual aid pages and spaces that are also organizing funds for Indigenous organizations and peoples. So with that, I will add the link in just a moment, but I also wanted to go over some technical instructions. We're going to mute everyone today until the Q&A session, but automatic captioning has been enabled. So if you click the live transcript button, and click show subtitle or view full transcript, you'll be able to see the captions and transcript. This event is also being recorded, so please keep in mind if you have questions that you'd like to ask at the end during the Q&A, and if you unmute yourself and you have your camera on, you will be recorded. So just keeping that in mind, but you're also welcome to, throughout the duration of the conversation, you can put questions and comments in the chat box. So now I'm just going to introduce our actual event today. So this is the fourth annual edition of the Laboratory of Feminist Memories. And this edition is called Intimate Dwellings, which is a two-part pandemic edition that's asking both artists and scholars to consider the role of the home and the domestic as a generative space for feminist and queer counter archives. So this particular discussion, Unsettling the Feminist Queer Archive, is a roundtable discussion that's brought together a really great group of artists, curators, and multidisciplinary scholars for an expansive conversation about their engagement with archives, not only as a research method, but as a material embodied site, as an artistic practice, and how they're engaging with feminist, queer, and decolonial approaches to archiving. Together, our guests are also going to talk about what lies outside of the realm of the institutional and colonial archive, and how the role of the personal, the domestic, the communal, and the body can make space for other stories, gestures, and modes of being. So I'm really very grateful to be here with all of you. So to get started, we're going to have we're going to have all of our speakers chat a little bit about their own engagement with archives in their personal practices. So our first speaker and guest today is Morgan Sears-Williams. Morgan is an interdisciplinary artist and cultivator based in Toronto. And her work is based in documentary and experimental practices using a combination of filmmaking, photography, installation, publication, and mixed media works. And using these disciplines as a tool for self-exploration, her practice often explores larger themes of feminist queer histories, collective memory, and questioning institutional archiving practices. And she's interested in conducting archival interventions with, in particular, with analog technologies. So I'll leave it at that and let Morgan speak for a few minutes about her practice with archives.
Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm a queer interdisciplinary artist and cultivator here in Toronto. And thinking about these questions of kind of feminist queer archive and practices, I feel as though there's many ways that I can speak to this, because I kind of engage with these ideas both in my artistic practice, but also in my role as programming coordinator at the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center. I think a lot about how institutional archives are perceived as a place of answers, of holding a truth. Additionally, thinking about who is it that these archives are seeing as histories and people that are important, people that are worthy of recording, and people that are valuable, that that a archivist or an institution wants people in the present and the future to access, to read, and to know these peoples and history. So in response to these ideas, I'm going to open up with this project that I started in 2017. I'm just going to share my screen here. And I'm just going to play this in the background as I kind of talk about this project. So I became really obsessed with this Rolodex that I found in 2017, and this was kind of a major part of my thesis project at OCAD. So a Rolodex typically holds, contact information. This one here probably would have been something used in an office space because it is quite large. But here in this project, I'm using it more as holding personal histories, historical and contemporary events, detailing moments in feminist and queer activism. So some of these typed cards are using personal I statements or talking about specific moments in time. And when I originally started this project, I was very focused on Toronto queer history from, say, 1980s to present, thinking about intergenerational knowledge transfer and decades of queer activists that are fighting similar struggles. So because of this, some of this text is dated, some of it is not. And the times that it's referencing can be kind of a little bit more ambiguous. And I use this project as organizing only through alphabetical order rather than chronologically kind of how we view time, doing this more as an idea of how to blend time and space and providing fragments rather than a narrative. And through this project, I also include cards that are blank, hinting at the work being unfinished and constantly shifting, offering a space for viewers to imagine maybe what they think should be included. So rather than the way that, we might typically view institutional archives as fixed, not moving, I kind of meant this more as like a counter to that, that history will always be shifting, but also importantly that multiple truths can exist simultaneously. And a lot of these, an emphasis on personal statements felt really important to me. It felt like a counter to institutional archive practices that require that knowledge be historical or factual. But again, I think we can ask, how is that knowledge deemed as historical or factual? So within this project, I was really trying to practice more the ideas that intuition and that personal lived experiences are that are not usually seen as credible within the realm of institutional archives are acknowledged as factual and also are affirmed. And I was really seeing the Rolodex more acting as kind of a vessel to approach these conversations and further asking viewers to question the responsibilities of intergenerational knowledge transfer within the queer community. So I've worked with these kind of objects before that I think evoke a type of nostalgia. So like a Rolodex, and I've worked with rotary telephones, library cards, thinking of these objects as a gateway to larger conversations, but also as a way to really engage folks, pre-COVID times when we would touch everything, but I think that it creates a different type of intimacy. Yeah, so that's kind of just my intro of a little snippet into my artistic practice and kind of what I have been thinking about for the past couple of years about the possibilities of a feminist queer archive. Yeah, and I'm just gonna pause it right there.
Thank you so much. That was really thoughtful and succinct. And I have a lot of questions that I'm already thinking about. So, but for the sake of time, I will keep things moving along. And our next guest is Amanda and Min Wong. So, hi, Amanda. Amanda is a Toronto-based filmmaker, writer, sound artist, and musician. And her work explores themes of loss, nostalgia, and memory, as well as finding purpose and community through the arts. And some of her directorial projects include An Object of Merit and Swim Low. And through the Invisible Footprints initiative, Amanda has recently directed an archival documentary entitled The Way We Are, which shares excerpts from audio interviews with 4 queer women. She is also an alumni of Ryerson's Image Arts program and is currently completing their MA in the University of Toronto's Cinema Studies Institute. And Amanda also has an incredible band called Cut Sleeve, which you should all check out on Spotify. I highly recommend that you do that. So take it away, Amanda.
Thanks so much for that awesome introduction. Now I don't really have anything left to say about myself, but thanks so much for doing that work for me. So nice to meet you, everybody. My name's Amanda. As Dhvani mentioned, I am a filmmaker, and I'm really I really like to explore these sorts of themes of loss and nostalgia and memory within my work as someone who immigrated to Canada at a later age. There's a lot of sort of these themes that I think about just in my personal life as well as the people that I work with and the people that I interview. So that's kind of around the lines of the things that of where I'm sort of looking at things from. Just a moment, I'm just going to turn my notifications off so I don't get that ding. Apologies. So I first started being acquainted, I suppose, with the idea of archival not not so much that it actually, whether it was archival, we can talk about it, but I became acquainted with that working in unscripted television. And when working in sort of like docudramas and documentary, there are sort of different formats of what is shown in a documentary. First, you have interviews, then you have B-roll, and you have, stock footage. And one of the categories is called archival. And this is usually the category that's designated to whoever is being interviewed, like provides their personal archive to be shown on the show, or if we found archival footage or archival images from somewhere in, an institution or some other kind of stock footage website. And then so that was kind of my first engagement with what is archival. And then I first started directly engaging with the topic when I was selected to be a part of Invisible Footprints, as Dhvani mentioned, which was this initiative to foster intergenerational relationships within Toronto's queer East and Southeast Asian community, and sort of explore this community's personal and public archives and how to work within that community. So through that, Invisible Footprints usually culminates with a symposium, and each year they sort of decide a theme of what kind of artwork is going to be done. So, they've done installations before, and the year that I was in was doing digital work, so digital video or film. So I'm just gonna share my screen a little bit, 1 second. While I talk, I can, hopefully it'll play under it. Share screen. Okay, can everybody see this playing right now? Yes, yes?
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is, I'm just playing through the film that I made called The Way We Are from the Invisible Footprints program. And it shares these audio interviews that I did with 4 queer East Asian women who in the program we called them elders. And they very generously donated their time and their personal archives to me to make this film. Their names are Nancy Sito, Catherine Chun, Tamai Kobayashi, and Wenda Lee. And 3 out of the 4 of them were involved with a community that started in 1989 and in the early 90s called Asian Lesbians of Toronto, that now isn't around anymore. And so part of this idea was also sort of documenting their histories of their childhood into adolescence and into adulthood, and then also featuring their sort of work with Asian Lesbians of Toronto. And through this, I also helped to digitize some of these archives that were given in like hard copy form that they didn't have digital records of. And there was a bunch of Super 8 reels that just came in like a shoebox. So that was really nice to sort of be able to help to do as well. And of course, there's so much to kind of get around that I wasn't able to digitize everything, but the important stuff. And then we can also talk about what designates important and non-important in archive. I think that's a larger discussion too. But basically with this film, I wanted to sort of recreate that feeling of intimacy of looking through a photo album with loved ones, and sort of, like when you hear someone talk about their stories around a living room table and you're looking at these photos. So I've learned a lot about the sort of history behind, here I'll fast forward to the Asian Lesbians of Toronto. I've learned a lot about the history of around that, but also part of the film was to kind of explore these archives as through a sort of present tense lens, to not look at it as sort of a historical documents, but to look at it as these are archives that are continuing today. And so most of the interviews were done in present tense. And I can talk a little bit more about that later, but I think I should end now and pass it on to the next person. So I'm excited to talk more with you all about this. How do I stop sharing screen? Here we go. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Amanda. So I believe our next guest is Geneviève. Yes, okay. Pronunciation is something I am trying to do as accurately as possible. But Geneviève is an independent curator, writer, and researcher based in Montreal, whose practice is informed by diasporic narratives, intersectional feminism, intergenerational dialogues, and BIPOC alternative healing platforms. And her ongoing research also focuses on the intersections of longevity and pleasure as contemplative spaces for care work in the arts. And her most recent curatorial projects include Back in 20 Minutes, presented with the CMFDC, as well as Made of Honey, Gold, and Marigold, presented at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa. And she's also the exhibition coordinator at FOFA Gallery, a member of the Black Curators Forum, and an advisory committee member for the Black Portraitures Conference, as well as having recently joined the advisory board for the Center for the Study of Black Canadian Diaspora. So please take it away.
And also a big part of my life, I'm a member of the collective Younger Than Beyonce Gallery. Hi, everyone. Thank you for convening here on this afternoon. I'm especially aware that a lot of exchange spaces are online now on Zoom, and sometimes, it can be quite tiring to navigate these spaces. So I'm grateful for your presence and anyone who is here with us. I do not have a presentation. I think it's really funny. This is my second invitation in terms of speaking to the archives, and I feel like I haven't really paid attention to the ways that I guess dealing with archives. And so I find it very interesting. And I think for me today, the proposition that I have is to treat curatorial practice as a practice of relational archiving. And I think this invitation posed really interesting questions for me or musings. And so I was thinking about the relationships that we're building as curators with our collaborators, with the public as an extension of collective memory. I've been thinking also about how our relationships intervene in the memories that we share about events or a space and individuals. And then I also have been thinking about how exhibitions act as a way of reactivating memories or a way of building new time continuums. I've been thinking about also on the micro scales, how exhibitions are also, they mark personal and communal growth as well. And I don't know, I was just thinking how curation is also a strange career. I stumbled into it in some regards. I was basically sure I would end up in fashion. That was where my eyes were on when I was a child and in high school. And I just took a turn in university level and learned about this job, what is curating, and it has shifted so much. And even in the language that we use to talk about curating, I think is interesting, because this is also a way of archiving methods and way of people relating to others. And so I think it's a funny way to to navigate the world. And I just feel in each exhibitions, there's kind of this way of present, the inner folds of time. There's always this juxtaposition between like past, present, and like foreseeable or possible futures, which I find very fascinating. And I also feel like my relationships and conversations are part of this kind of like ongoing archive as well, which all the time is basically conversations beginning kind of investigations, and these investigations becoming sometimes exhibition projects. So it's been, it's just really interesting. And I've been realizing that within a lot of exhibitions, I am interested in knowledge within each of us. I'm interested in the ways that informations are passed down. I also like to delve into the gaps that we have within our own individual histories or histories from our communities, and how these converge and coalesce with communities that are outside of ourselves, and all interdependent, and that actually those memory gaps echo a fuller story from another end as well. So this is me about curation and archive and memory, I guess. Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here.
Thanks so much. No, that was great. And I loved particularly like your comments around curating as relational archiving and exhibitions as a space to activate memory. So I'm excited to chat about that and want to keep the ball rolling here. So I want to introduce our final guest speaker, and that is Dr. Ayanna Dozier, who is an artist, both in performance and film, as well as a lecturer, curator, and scholar. She recently completed her PhD in art history and communication studies at McGill, and her dissertation entitled Mnemonic Aberrations compiled and theorized the history of Black feminist experimental film and video art across the UK and the US from 1968 to the present. She is also the recipient of the 2020 Tony Beauchamp Prize for Critical Art Writing, and her forthcoming film and photographic installation, Cities of the Dead, will premiere at the Shed as part of their open call exhibition in the summer of 2021. And she is also currently a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum and a lecturer in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University. So.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to participate. Thank you to all of the organizers for putting this together. As someone coming right off the heels of my university work and organizing events, I know the labor that goes into that. So I'm especially grateful for just the care. So I just timed myself. So 5 minutes, who am I? What am I doing? What do I have to say about the prompt, right? Well, here's an image. This is an archival image of Hart Island, which is here in New York City. Now, Hart Island is an island that the dejected are buried. And the dejected means that if you are unclaimed when you pass away, if you pass away when you are experiencing a state of homelessness, your body is sent here. And this is not only somewhat antiquated, it's very much a 19th century invention, but it is unique in that most states have moved on from this, that if you are buried, or rather, if you pass away unclaimed, without health insurance, or if you're experiencing a state of homelessness, your body is cremated. So there is something unique within this morbidity of the fact that we do have an active record, right, of all of the ways in which we have labeled and positioned individuals while they're alive as outside of the realm of care. And in death, perhaps we can start to redress that care and think critically about a kind of living death archive, as opposed to thinking of the archive as solely what's around us in the present. Now, my project for the shed starts with Hart Island, and it reimagines a proposal for a Negro Coney Island that was put together by Barbados-born realtor Solomon Riley. He completed it, and in 1924, 2 weeks before it was supposed to open, the city decided to condemn all of Hart Island because of the Potter's Field, where the burials are, but critically because of the idea that Black individuals would have leisure and a place free and unbesmirched from racism at the other attractions. As soon as they condemned the island, while there have been buildings on this place since the 19th century, Negro Coney Island is the only place that all of the buildings, all of that architectural memory was completely erased. This archival image here from the 1940s is the only record where we can see that there was something there. We can see the boardwalk, we can see these buildings, we can see that. Hart Island today has no visible trace of this massive invention. Now, in starting there, what my work does is it works through that tension around narratives of personal and public, and critically, the effort of truth that we place upon certain records. That when you think of the archive, we have a truth value to it, that if it exists within a public records or an institution, or if it has a materiality of the past, when in fact, there's so many researchers who have demonstrated that this in fact is already a constructed narrative. This brief image here comes from a scholar who is doing archival research on sound, and I only have it up because it reminds me of the first time I kind of intervene on this past, where in doing this research, she puts African Americans in the miscellaneous, so she fills in the blanks. And I called attention to why Black individuals were put in miscellaneous. And the scholar's response was, it was just extra information. But that in fact reaffirms what archival research does, that oftentimes people who are marginalized are just that, miscellaneous information, that when you do certain types of archival practices, that you're looking at an archive that has no record or doesn't have a vocabulary to think about people at the margins as actually human, right? And we know this from Saidiya Hartman's work of how do you do archives on Black subjects when you recognize that you have to look for property, right, at a certain time period, as opposed to someone's personhood. So what this does for me is it makes available all the ways in which these kind of temporal past documents are not only constructed, but they are utilized as a way to shape and define how we perceive of reality. This is an image of one of the early cinematic cameras, and it's modeled after a gun coming from Carl Akeley and George Eastman Kodak. So in utilizing this image, I'm just gonna kind of link forward to my work in the next few slides. I utilize the work of photography then, of film, as a way of, I'm going to pass through this, as a way of combating that materiality, and all of the ways in which we look at certain types of film documents and we think, oh, well, that has a level of truth to it. My work then takes on Saidiya Hartman's and G. Deleuze's term of critical fabulation, where I weaponize that aesthetic, right? Fully aware of its colonial context, as a way to really navigate what does it mean that I'm talking about something in the past, but I'm doing this work in the present. Here's a brief example of an installation I had 2 years ago around the permanent wave machine invented by Marjorie Joyner. And here's the archives. It was made for Black women, but Black women were erased from that record. So I decided to use this moment of the present to restore that kind of erasure, but purposely wanted to make it look and feel as if it was something of the past. So I'll end here. The video, it's a trailer for a film that I made out of this, but it ties me back to where I began with the work of Solomon Riley. That if we're recognizing that we're already working with these kind of histories, these archival documents that are built upon erasure and that are critically cannibalized by institutions at the same time. I'm not interested in going back to the past and trying to find quote unquote truth there. I recognize that that's a constructed truth. What I then want to do is think about all of the things that could have happened, right? And I want to play upon how we value materiality of the past as a way to reimagine what could be. So there's a lot of play upon what we think to be truthful. I'm purposefully, I wouldn't say I'm tricking anyone, but I do play upon your expectations. And I often define my archival practice as authentically inauthentic. I'm committed to the artificiality of it insofar as I want us to understand that those documents that we think are truthful, right, are actually marred by institutional power, and if not indexed by curatorial erasure at the level from the top. And the new project that I have is another intervention into that practice.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna ask Michael to just pin all of our guest speakers. I'm mindful of time, but I just want to almost like take just like 10, 15 seconds to absorb like the weight of everyone's words. I'm thinking about how so many of you have touched upon engagements in terms of the temporality of archiving, thinking about whose histories and bodies exceed the archive or the institutional archive, but also the role of speculation and imaginary archives, the role of remixing and recontextualizing archival footage. So I'm really grateful to be here to kind of delve into those questions. Before I get started, I did want to just put a link in the chat box. This is just a working bibliography of some articles that have I've been reading, including articles by a lot of articles and programs and films that our wonderful guests have written or directed. And I just wanted to share that because I think it's important to also cite all of the work that you've all been doing and to create that practice of citation. So my questions that I'm posing to all of you today are also coming from works and articles and scholars that I've encountered. So I'm also mindful of people and scholars you've mentioned, and I'm going to add that to the bibliography, but it'll be open to for people to take a look. So yeah, so I think first to just get started, I'm gonna have a pretty broad conversation because I think many of you also touched upon that tension between public versus personal histories. So I first wanted to get into that question of what is the role or the roles that the personal, the domestic, and the communal can play in feminist and queer memory work, but how the uses of the domestic or the personal might also counteract some of the exclusions and violence that's inherent in institutional and colonial archiving. But I'm also interested in how you see your relationship with archives as maybe both a personal and political practice. And so I'll leave that question first, and you're welcome to take it up in any way that you would like.
I'll bite. So one thing that in terms of that personal public boundary, and I think Amanda's work is a really great example of this, is the way that we can recognize personal experiences, especially from those at the margins, often exceeds what can be institutionally known about a group of people, right? Because it comes from that just lived experience, organizational work, ephemera, notes, things like that. However, the one thing that my research from my doctoral studies made me rethink that narrative is how institutions love that, right? And how a lot of that type of work now is cannibalized as part of their records. And in that process, what gets left out? And I forgot, I don't know if Amanda had mentioned this, or perhaps Morgan might have mentioned this, but when we can place tension on what the important stuff, what makes it in, right? We can rethink that term. And even as we're doing that work, someone else has already done that for us and has already started to kind of weed out and curate a kind of narrative engagement around the personal and how that's fetishized by a lot of institutions. My research on Black feminist experimental film, I was very, I think, not just appalled, but I had to rechange my entire theoretical position, because I went in there thinking, oh, this is great, I'm finding out about this forgotten history, you know, only to find out that a lot of the institutions that housed some of these records, these films, were fetishizing it and tokenizing it in a way that became very cannibalistic, and did not afford that kind of care of what does it mean to think about allowing a lived experience to be. So I say in response that I think that while we can definitely emphasize personal, you know, over something that's perceived to be publicly available, I also recognize that actually a lot of our public archives, in fact, bear that personal weight, and that boundary when it comes to archives is actually not only mirrored, but it's very complicated because of the way in which institutions house these records.
I'll speak a little bit just in response. I think that's a really, really good point you brought up, Ayanna, about how what is it's not even just about what is important to be chosen. It's us doing the work of when we're finding these archives, and then also audiences seeing it, already crafting their own narrative from it. I think it's I think it's Akil Mbembe who talks about how archives can be, it's almost like debris, and then you sort of reconstruct your own narrative from debris, right? But so I'm sort of trying to think of it, of how we can move beyond seeing archive as debris, as the sort of trace of history of things that are left behind, right? Like if we sort of, how can we sort of approach archives through a lens of a present? So instead of sort of thinking it as, we have to use these debris as representations of a building that once was, it is a building that currently is and still continues to be. So just sort of thinking about it in those sort of abstract images. And I think as a media creator too, like there is a huge responsibility to kind of be wary about the amount of what we consider important to include into things or not. And it's so tough because, you know, people are only going to watch things in a 5-minute, 15-minute, half an hour bite. And it's what do we choose to show in this media that is going to not only sort of give everything of what the person who's that media that personal archive belongs to, that that correct, and to say correct is also, you know, there is not really a correct, but in order to tell their truth, right, as we're talking about, I think it was both you, Ayanna, and Morgan, who's talking about truths, multiple truths as being able to exist at the same time, and to how to tell their truth while also making it a truth that is things that audiences and other people can see as well. I was thinking a lot about also sort of archiveology, if people have heard the term. There's this, I just have it right next to me, but there's this book called, oh, it's got clipped in the green screen, by Catherine Russell, that sort of talks about, you know, archiveology as an art practice that takes, you know, archival works and makes it its own, but it's not just a representation of those historical archival, it itself also becomes archive, right? So continuing to sort of think about the present and keeping the archives in the present and the future. Yeah. I would love to hear everyone else's thoughts on this too.
I might also just, like, picking up a thread of what you said, like introduce another question that people can also feel free to respond to, just based on what you were saying of trying to engage with archives in the present, or seeing them as living documents, not rendering archives to the past, because I think most of you all touched upon temporality in relation to archiving. And so I wanted to pose a question of how do we kind of move away from this colonial notion of linear time when we're interacting or reading the archive or engaging in archival practices, and in fact, how do past, present, and future interact, and can we move away from this idea of strict segmentation and narrative holes, especially as you point to this idea, like the truth value of the institutional colonial archive is also an expression of colonial power. So I wanted to pose that, kind of bring in that question of temporality, especially as histories, I think, of violence and dispossession are not ongoing So if we read them in the archives, they're not something of the past, but they're with us and they continue with us into the future. I hope that was clear. But I know it's heavy and lots of words, so I'll give maybe a moment just to breathe and reflect.
I think it's a hard question to answer, to be quite honest. Only because there's so many factors, and then there's also like, in the terms of like defining then what would be in the archive. Like, I don't want to go like to physical or like full-on philosophical, but I think like the dichotomy of institutional archive and domestic archive is like sometimes kind of like a dichotomy that is like hard to go outside of. And they both have also like linearity, like a linearity to it. Like, let's say like even the domestic archive, like the way that we will catalog our own photo albums, we're tracing a linear like trace of ourselves and our families, the way that we are also kind of like the conversations that we have with members of our family or people that are making up our family is also very regulated by time. And non-linearity is, I think for me, is more a transposition of like multi-dimensionality. Like, so in terms of my existence now and how I define it is like in correlation with someone else's definitions, and therefore adds another like that like dimension that is happening right now. Okay, I'm not gonna get lost. But I feel like it's a very interesting question to ask, but a hard one, like the questions that you have been asking, but like hard ones to give like full straight up answers to. But I think right now I'm thinking a lot about the conversations that I have, the one that I have in private, that are like nourishing my practice, and how these are like within themselves like ephemeral in the moment, but are resonated like in my memory and the people with who I've been speaking to, and kind of like redefine and reshape the way we navigate the world. And I'm like, is this part of the archive, those exchanges? They can, as like, I love when Ayanna, I'm trying to have the hard A. Is it Ayanna? Sorry. So in thinking about like, of the people who have been doing the work before us, and how it's easily erased, as we've also seen with Morgan and Amanda's work as well, and how there's always this effort of recollecting those interventions, recollecting this labor, and it's all part of like the intentions to not give in to collective amnesia that further decentralize those histories. And so when thinking about like how my practice is influenced by intergenerational conversations, I find it very crucial to be in conversations with people who have been doing the work that I'm doing before me. But like, and so having them in mind and doing this labor, like you were talking about, Dhvani, like the labor of citing and making sure that this labor is remembered. And so I don't know if I want to get out of linearity, because I think it's actually very important in that sense. I don't know where I'm going. I'm going to leave it there. But just want to say that kitchen table conversations, this is like basically where my archiving practice is very focused on.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And it was part of like the impetus for for organizing this event in 2 parts was to have that intergenerational dimension. So like tomorrow when we have our conversation with speakers who are sharing objects and stories from their personal archives, but also speaking to their involvement in different activist and community movements. What you even were saying about this idea of collective amnesia, I was thinking about when you are doing archiving and you have this sense of discovery, or when you recover a story or a history, there's, especially that you have, say, a communal or personal relation to, there's like this feeling both of elation of like being recognized within an archive, but then there's a sense also, I think, a frustration in terms of how conversations around race and decoloniality kind of have this cyclical nature. They keep kind of continuing to reoccur.
If I may briefly, because I think this touches upon what also Geneviève, right? Yeah. Was getting at with regards to the existentiality of that kind of question, in that, yes, it's not something, we can like answer in like an hour and 15 minutes. I wish it was, because then our lives would be easier. But it is like a question to pose, right? That asking these things, right, is what constitutes a kind of ongoing study, so that we carry it with us. But in that regards, I think that language of discovery, right? I had that when I started doing archival research of, I'm doing work on subjects who look very much like me, right? Who are interested in the same stuff, right? Experimental film, all of that stuff. And I would say the first year and a half of my research was discovery. And I absolutely had that sense of, I found this, only for me to recognize, I didn't find anything, right? This was erased, and then I found other people who had been trying to build it, and then that was also erased. And I think that it's super important that we recognize that, as useful as the academy can be, right? The academy also indoctrinates us through discourse to appropriate, even when we're doing our work on subjects like ourselves, we are indoctrinated to kind of center that discovery, colonial, individual kind of neoliberal claim on the work that becomes part of like me. And that sense of temporality is that question of temporality. How do we rethink time? I think is very much tied to the method of doing this type of research, which is, even coming out of a lot of feminist studies, absolutely intimately connected to the discovery colonial language around it being centered and filtered through you, as opposed to understanding these are living things. These are things that are multiplicity. And what has helped me is looking at the work of, Black feminist scholars, but I think Toni Morrison is helpful when she says a dose of the spiritual world, right? And whatever spirituality might be for you, but something like that is needed to combat this, that deep type of cultural communal care and work that is so outside of what the university can teach us. That's like ghost and all the stuff the university is like, that's not material history. Like, you need to go there to really de-link yourself from that type of temporal arrangement. And that doesn't necessarily mean a complete loss of linearity, but it does mean something outside of it, right? And it does mean something that also is no longer individual, but a kind of collective. And that doesn't necessarily mean material collectivity, but maybe even ephemeral, ghosts, the past, futures, all of that stuff.
I think it's really interesting that you talked about language, because I'm like a discovery, like the word discovery, and I'm thinking also about mining the archive. It's very extractive, the words that we're using in terms of our relationship with archival material, but also archival material usually in institutions are built within the practice of extracting from communities. And so what does it mean when you are reclaiming this material, and like what is the language around reclaiming? And maybe this is also kind of like part of the conversations if we are to think about other models or other interactions with the archive or archiveology. Amanda, is that the word? I want to read this. It looks really interesting.
Yeah, you got it. I'm gonna jump in here and like, okay, all of this is resonating with me so much. I think it is interesting to also think about like, I find that sometimes when we do archival work, not everybody, but something that is maybe it is part of the indoctrination, but the impulse in doing archival work is, yeah, discovery and this idea of like saving, you know, like we are saving something by either making it making oral material or material digital. And it's hard to, it's like, I have to constantly remember that there is no such thing as that unless there is something that somebody wants. And some people also don't want their to be archived, right? And we have to respect that not everybody or not everything wants to be archived in the way that we think an archive functions. And that's something that I have to always sort of try to remember myself too. And that, you know, there are many people, especially I find in the immigrant community here in Canada, that where archive is not something that is good because of the history of trauma that has happened before. And in archiving something, you are leaving a sort of, it is almost a vulnerability. And instead, the sort of not being a part of the archive or having your own personal archive that is not accessible to others is a form of refuge, right? So that's kind of what, kind of where I'm thinking about it, to just kind of get out of this sort of institutionalized idea of archives and how that they're not always good or wanted or needed.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that as well, like a couple years ago when I had a studio visit with Ayanna Lee, who is a curator that lives in Toronto, and talking about this project that I shared earlier, like similarly, not everyone wants to be included for very valid reasons. And I think, you know, of that idea of debris that you brought up, that I really like that idea. Just thinking of kind of like how you are reconstructing from the debris. Like when I was originally doing research for that project, I was in the archives in Toronto, and that, to me at that time, did feel like a type of debris of decades of queer history, but of who were the dominant narratives in the archives. And yeah, I'm kind of thinking like around what Ayanna said, where you know, we know that those spaces are constructed truths, and thinking about maybe we don't want to go back into those constructed truths, but instead looking at what could happen, what could, like, thinking also about what Geneviève, you said around like these new time continuums. I wrote that down. I'm obsessed with that idea of exhibitions being these new time continuums. And yeah, just reinvigorating these different kinds of memories that maybe we are kind of maybe subconscious, but yeah, I'm kind of like a big, one of my favorite films is The Watermelon Women by Cheryl Dunye, where this is around the same idea where she's, you know, searching for this person that maybe exists, maybe doesn't exist, and thinking more kind of, I think, relying on this like imaginary archive, that I've been kind of obsessed with that idea.
No, the Watermelon Woman is such a great example because Zoe Leonard, right, the photographer who worked on that project, they just created that. Like they knew that woman could have existed in time.
Yeah.
They don't have the record to do it. So you just do it to kind of give it a presentness in the moment.
Yeah.
I think what's also so interesting is, in particular, those photos used for the film, like the Faye Richards it became an archive in it of itself. It's like travel to multiple exhibitions, and I'm struggling to remember the museum that's acquired the collection off the top of my head. But I think I want to open up maybe to audience questions in a minute or two, but I think there are two things I'm from this conversation. One thing that I have gathered, one is that idea of how do we also in our archival practices leave space for refusal and also understand the limits of representational politics within the archive, especially given that not everyone wants to be made into an archival object or what itself it means to be archived and then potentially have your histories or stories appropriated in ways that you necessarily didn't give consent to. And I brought up the question of the use of, or why I'm particularly interested in the use of like personal or familial archives and that trend, especially in art making, is I'm often wondering, have the families or the people who are part of those personal domestic archives especially if they're no longer with us, did they really give consent to be put on display or available for public consumption? So you've given me a lot in terms of thinking about that question, but touching upon the watermelon woman and the use of speculation and imaginary archives, I'm also struck by this idea and what you mentioned, Geneviève, about time continuums. Can the feminist queer archive be the space of possibility and world building? Can it act as a call to action rather than being this space of closure or definitive truths? So I'll maybe leave those thoughts there if you'd like to take them up or respond to them, but I want to give space to our wonderful audience members to ask questions. So I'm going to invite people to pose questions in the chat now. Michael, if you can allow people to, if you can use the raise hand function, or you can just unmute yourself and pose your question to everyone. Feel free to. In the meantime, maybe if we're waiting for questions, so Glad Day will unmute someone if they have a question. So I think my co-organizer, Mauricia, has a question first. So Mauricia, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks everyone for your amazing presentations and your enviable ability to sum things up in a very short time. I want to go back to the sort of the framework for our two events, Feminist Memory, and ask all of you, what do you see as the relationship or the relationality with the archives that you're working with and feminist memory, and maybe with the idea of memory as a kind of mobile framework, so not just what was in a fixed point in time, but what could have been or what could be. And Amanda, since your work probably works, the work that you mentioned works more explicitly with those ideas, maybe you could start up and respond.
Sure, yeah. So just to clarify, you're asking about the sort of relationship between the theme of that we're talking about feminist and queer archives and our own practices, is that correct?
Yeah, but specifically feminist memory in terms of an archive that has that often exists primarily at least in terms of my research in domestic space, and that has been displaced by official archives and even sometimes queer archives as well.
Right. Yeah, I think it's thanks for bringing us back to sort of a feminist memory as well, because I think that I was having this discussion with somebody else earlier about how archives seem to be, at least public archives, seem to be often gendered as very masculine, you know, and then we sort of think about domestic and personal as feminine. And it's, I was just thinking about how it came to be that way, or if it was just that, you know, archives themselves are, you know, patriarchal. And so part of, you know, I think what is important in showing in my work specifically is that the voices of women, right, specifically the ones who do want to be archived, who want their stories to be told, and in a way that isn't just limited to the framework of what archives are supposed to be as we think of it, or and in just the ways that they can tell their personal stories or share their personal experiences, or even the images that they share of themselves or of others. And I think with a, you know, sort of, I talked about Asian Lesbians of Toronto and how it was a group that used to exist that doesn't exist now. And I think that fits well in what you're saying about how, you know, the possibilities of what could be, or what could, or still is, or could have been, or still is, or could still be. And thinking about, you know, sure, Asian Lesbians of Toronto, the group itself doesn't exist anymore today, but, you know, Queer Asian Youth still does. ACAS still runs programs for queer Asians in the community. All of these, you know, this work is continuing. It is not something that is just something that exists in the past or the present or the future. I think that there's a level of, you know, temporal distance that we try to think about when we think about memories, and really memories are things that we think about all the time. They are with us regardless of time. I'm going on a little bit of tangent here. Maybe I'll throw it to somebody else. Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I really kind of thinking about what you just said around archives. I think maybe institutional archives being very patriarchal, being seen as masculine, you know, factual. They have authority. They tell the story. Doesn't seem like a story. They're telling what the story is as the only story. And I think for me, what I've been trying to integrate, you know, in the project that I showed earlier, but also in other projects, is around how, you know, intuition and an archive of like feelings maybe is very dismissed. And thinking, I think for me, feminist memory and archiving more about how multiple truths, like I said, multiple truths existing simultaneously, and truths that can also kind of like, what's the word? Just like count each other out or be contradicting. There you go. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about as well.
And like riffing off Morgan, you were talking about intuition as well, like as intuition of and carrying feelings. I'm also thinking about the ways in which we can reconvene, and how we transfer knowledge to each other through conversations. But I was thinking about gossip, and how gossip has been also dismissed as even as even like holders of truth, although sometimes, you know, there are exaggerations, and truth in the objective, because objectivity never really exists, like is distorted. There's always a seed of something that should be taken in there for like as valuable information. And gossip has been very useful for women, gender non-conforming peoples, in queer communities, in terms of for safety and solace and where to go, and who should we avoid, or, you know, who can be, you know, an ally, or an accomplice. Like gossip is a terrain that like is also contested in feminist theory as something to, you know, dismiss in the collection of knowledge.
I just want to like sit for a minute and just absorb everything that everyone is saying. And I hate that we're so pressed for time, which is on me because I could have, made it a little bit longer. But I want to leave it open to other audience members to pose their questions. And then if not, I can maybe end off with a final kind of question. But I really wish to continue this conversation, and even all of the different, even the ideas and concepts that you've mentioned, I am going to try and make sure that I'm citing them and using them and putting it in the bibliography, because there's so, just this idea, even you're so right, Geneviève, of gossip being dismissed and disparaged, but whispers within the community are things that have also saved me so many times from bad situations. So I so appreciate that. I think I'll ask a question then while we're waiting, but maybe a little bit of a lighter question because we've been working with such heavy elements. And I don't know if it's actually, now I'm thinking about it, no, it's not as light, but I was thinking about the question of like intimacy and affect and rituals when working with the domestic or the communal and the personal, and can those kinds of archives engender different feelings and relations and emotions. And I was thinking about this question because I read your article, Ayanna, in Art Text about heartbreak in the with Black feminist archives. So that's kind of where that question came from. So I'll leave that to everyone.
Yeah. So as that piece came several years ago, it was written a year before it was published, which I think was 2019. So I wrote it in 2018. And it marked a shift in my research methods, which I've already talked a little bit about somewhat in my introduction, but then also in some of the discussion that's followed. I value the institution. I'm still in my honeymoon phase with my PhD. Probably in 6 months, I'll be like, just call me Ayanna. But there are things that I do value. There are. But I also, I'm doing a lot of reflecting and realize that even as a Black feminist, right, there's a lot that we are kind of indoctrinated within, and that we are in fact become tools that reproduce the institution. And to the point on Genevieve's use of gossip, which is something I've written about elsewhere in my work, how that has not only saved me, but it's also, I'm like known as a gossiper, because that's how you spread what's actually up, right? And that's how you let someone know that that person who writes a lot about labor actually abuses their students, right? That feminist male scholar who writes a lot of books actually has a history of sexual assault. And to find that within the institution, and to realize within myself, right, that I was reproducing that unintentionally through things like discovery language, through things like individualizing the work, through things as claiming that archive as like, oh, I did this. It was really a bit of an existential crisis for me. And I needed to find other knowledge methods, right? Ways of learning, ways of teaching, ways of distributing knowledge that felt completely outside of the institution, while still valuing, the work and the pedagogy that I was learning and the access to resources that the institution gave me. I needed to find something else. And affect within the institution, there's a complicated history there. It's sometimes it's weaponized for it, sometimes it's not. But I often find that sometimes it falls short, that they're happy to keep affect as a kind of way of thinking of labor that can be reestablished for the institution, like emotional labor that then goes back in service of the institution of doing that type of difficult work. But they never get to the heart of it, of like, what does it mean to be full on depressed doing this research? What does it mean to be overworked, right? To be gaslit and still have to turn out the work? What does it mean to be completely heartbroken, which that was one point in my life, just devastated from family things and by the institution, and still have the institution tell me, well, you're going to go in that archive and you're going to find something that's going to make you this and that, and in a way that doesn't actually sideline that emotion, but says, this is what I have to work with. Like, I need to work with this, and not in a way that also mobilizes that as like, oh, work through all of your problems, like at all, but in a way that recognizes that that's not something that you can put to the side. That if you're living with depression, right, especially if you're living with depression caused by the institution, if you're living with existential heartbreak caused by the institution, like that's what the research is gonna be shaped by. And that's where I was in that time in my life. And that's also what shaped the rest of my project, is that I had to move beyond discovering anything. And I had to think, okay, I'm talking about women who themselves have been very violated, that I see myself as violated by the institution in various ways. That's the work, that there's no way I can divorce this as not being personal. No, I'm heartbroken, I'm sad, I'm like crying all the time. That's the work, that's the research. And that's how I'm going to articulate it in a way that is viable for others outside of it, right? But in a way that also, I think, retains the integrity of it as a living object that can also compel you to be heartbroken by it.
Thank you. I think it kind of goes back to even that theme where we were discussing a little bit earlier, where there's this co-optation of language by the institution. There's also this, if we're working with personal archives or things that we feel are radical or counter to the institution, there comes a point where it's reabsorbed into state or institutional narratives. And I guess there's just this always constant tension between what is included and what's excluded, and how that I don't think has to or should be resolved. Like, that tension is also productive and necessary. So it is 4:20, and I think we have to wrap up soon. And I also wanted to smile when I said it was 4:20. But I wanted to maybe just give space if any of you would like to add some final words, or also just mention some projects that you have that you are working on, if you would like to share. But if you just want to just have any final thoughts before I just mention, I wrap up with some concluding remarks about tomorrow's event. So yeah, I'll just leave space for that first.
I like what you brought up in terms of like rituals with archives, and I was wondering in terms of like, how can we honor different type of archives? How do we carry them with us in our work? The intentions, how do we show up for these archives? I think these are like really beautiful thoughts to leave with that have been very present in these conversations. But I really like the word rituals. Like, I'm like, what can it mean actually to establish rituals with archives? How can that manifest, like physically, but also in just like in engagement? And yeah, that's just some rambling I was thinking about. But I want to thank everyone for all of your generous responses, and to Dhvani also for organizing this, and for this incredible, again, labor of love of putting this like ongoing Google documentation that is like available for everyone. So opening your own research archives with us is also yeah, it's really great. Thanks.
I think also what Geneviève and Ayanna, you made me think about is that feminist and queer memory provide an archive of care that that is ignored by the academic institution. So we have like these wellness, HR organized wellness departments that are really quite oppressive, and that strive to limit things like sick days or medical leave. They really do quite the reverse of what the word says. And I've noticed, particularly during the pandemic, as people, as friends or colleagues get sick or experience mental illness, that there's this like almost body memory or community memory that snaps into place where, you know, on social media or email or a combination of both, people are there for one another within, you know, within particular communities. And so that too is, you know, that's certainly part of my feminist memory is that those networks of care that I think we have to consciously bring to the institutions that we work in.
I think I don't want to pressure. There's been a lot of chatting and people have said so many great things. So maybe before we wrap up, Marussia, do you want to just talk a little bit about tomorrow's event and what time it is, and just so people know, it's the same Zoom link as this one, and it's kindly also co-sponsored by Glad Day. And hopefully some of you will also attend tomorrow so we can also continue that intergenerational dimension of the conversation. But yeah, Marussia, if you want to add anything.
So yeah, I posted info in the chat, and I'm really excited about the event. It'll be a sort of more cabaret-like, more performance and art oriented. There's going to be a comedian, Monica Garrido, who's part of my Buddies in Bad Times community, and some amazing poets and artists like Margaret Christakos, who's here today, and the poet and activist Lai Wan, performance artist and activist Shauna Dempsey. So yeah, really hope you can join us, and we'll have a bit of time for discussion tomorrow as well. So you can bring the ideas from here and mix them up with tomorrow's event.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention to everyone, I posted in the chat, we're just doing a tiny little call for submissions through a Google form, asking people if they would like to share a memory or object and story from their personal and domestic archives. And there's a chance in the form to say if you would like to give consent to be included in any public posts we make. We're kind of interested in compiling stories and reflections from these past two events, and from that call for submissions, and hopefully putting together a blog post so we can, again, continue to share these ideas, but cite all of the great work and labor that everyone has put into over the course of this ongoing symposium. So I think I'll leave it at that if anyone wants to say anything else, but thank you so much for, first of all, to all my wonderful guests for accepting the studio's invitation. Thank you to Marussia for helping me co-organize this, and I'm so looking forward to tomorrow. You and all the people who showed up today to listen, really, really appreciate everyone's insights. So I'll leave it at that, and then if anyone has any logistical questions about tomorrow, I'll just stay on for a few minutes. But it is the same Glad Day event link and password as today. So thank you, everyone.